Welcome to FOM3. This is Boardman here with my FOM3 map. It'll go over just an overview of a lot of the physiology that you'll need to know for the exam. It's not going to go over everything because I did this on a whiteboard and I can't fit everything on there. So this is as much as I could do. This is not necessarily to learn from. It's more about trying to see the bigger picture and seeing the relationship between a lot of the physiology because as you've probably learned over FOM3, a lot of it is very connected. And so just starting off, we'll just start with the Wicker's diagram kind of on the left side of the whiteboard. Also note the frog in the upper right corner in honor of Dr. Talbot, who helped me a lot with this map. Oh, yeah. We also have, just before I start, Krystle Parnala, student of the month for several months in 2024, who's helping me with this recording and annotating. So, okay, so starting with the Wiggers diagram, I kind of made a modified version because it also includes, if you look up at the top, flow volume loop, which is again modified to try to fit the curve as best as or the rest of the diagram as best as I can. So we will start with talking about the EKG. As you see in the black, you just have your T wave, your QRS complex, and your your P wave QRS complex and your T wave at the end. I've tried to fit several of the events and the timing in there, kind of like the Wiggers diagram did. And so we want to start with diastole before the P wave. You see you have an open tricuspid and mitral valve, and the right left will kind of represent which one is open first. So the tricuspid and diastole will open first before the mitral. And then next, as you proceed through, you're in the red, you'll have your mitral and tricuspid valve closing, and it closes from left to right. So it opens right side to left side, but then left will close first before the right. And then next, after the atrial systole, and then once you have the QRX complex going on and your ventricles start to contract, your pulmonic and aortic valves will open up. So the right side will open up before the left. And then also near the end of systole, when your pressure drops, your aortic valve will close first before your pulmonic. So left to right will close. And then you start your diastole. Some other events. When you start atrial systole after your P wave, which, the P wave will just trigger the contractions. So the contractions happen after. Your systole will close, your atria and your ventricles will close and relax at different times. So the right, left in the atrial systole means that it'll contract right first and then left, and then the right side in the left, the right atria and then the left atria will relax. So right atria contract, left atria contract, right atria relax, left atria relax. Next in ventricular systole, you also notice I wrote left, right, left, right. That means that your left ventricle will contract before your right ventricle, and then again, subsequently, your left ventricle will relax before your right ventricle. The reason why I believe that the atrial systole, the right atria kind of contract first before your left, and then your left ventricle contract next is kind of like to build up an extra back pressure so that it pushes the fluid out of the left ventricle into the aorta a little bit more. Some other noteworthy things right below the EKG, right with the valve opening and closing, and during the systole and diastoles, you'll see I drew different heart sounds in the magenta. And so this beginning, you have your in your around your T wave time, right when you start your atrial systole, you'll have your stenosis, and it'll kind of sound like a ascending crescendo kind of dealio. And this one should be your, since your valves are open, mitral valve that's open, I believe, that you are listening to for that stenosis. And then right afterwards, you can have your mitral valve regurgitation, which is during your systole, which is, your valve's supposed to be closed. And so if you hear that holosystolic sound, that'll be some of the blood backing up back through the mitral valve. Next, you'll have your aortic stenosis, which is your classic crescendo decrescendo sound during systole. And then lastly, you'll have your aortic regurgitation during diastole, which during diastole, your aorta should not be, the aortic valve should not be leaking blood out because you want to keep it going forward. If you want to move up really quickly, just to the, thank you. So in the purple, you will have our pulmonary wedge pressures, which is going to approximate your left atria. And again, I timed it with the rest of the EKG in contraction, in relaxation. So during the V phase, that's your venous return or the filling at the beginning during diastole. And then right when you start to have your P wave fire, and then your contractions happen, your Y descent is your tricuspid valve that's starting to open up. So when that opens up, the pressure in your atria will drop. And then once you start doing atrial systole, then the pressure, so just to preface, the y-axis, which I didn't draw one here, would be your pressure, and then going across from left to right would be time. So then as the atrial kick and systole happens, your pressure will go up as it starts to pump blood out from the right atria or left atria into your ventricle. And then you have your valve closure, which is when you're having when you start your ventricular systole, because you want to close your pulmonic valve so that you don't really have backflow, or not pulmonic valve, physicians, your tricuspid valve closing so that it doesn't backflow into your from your left ventricle into your left atria. Ooh. That if you look also above, the valve closure also kind of coincides with isometric contraction, which is marked in that brown line where you have, that's a volume curve of the left ventricle. And also you realize that your pressure should go up in there as well, denoted by that black line. So isometric contraction, your pressure is building up, that valve is closed, the pressure is building up in that left ventricle, ready to fire, so that it injects all that blood all at once into your aorta. And so then when you have your relaxation, that's when that's pretty much after your left ventricle has finished contracting. And as you can see, that left ventricular volume drops, as well as that pressure rises up and then starts to drop. And then once that happens, the diastole starts. You have your isometric relaxation when your aortic valve should close, your left ventricle pressure should start to go down, but you're relatively, if you look at the volume, it stays relatively flat during that relaxation. So nothing really changes in the left ventricle, and then you start your venous return again. Next, if we go down below, we'll talk a little bit more about the action potential itself and the contractility of the cardiac muscles. So timing wise, I matched this kind of with the EKG as well, where you have your, on your left side, your slower action potentials versus your fast action potentials during your T and QRS, P and QRS complexes, respectively. So starting at your sinoatrial node, the SA node, that's where you'll have your slow action potential, which is denoted by that phase 4 having that curve and not being flat. And here in that slow action potential, you have your 3 different channels that are your 4 channels that you care about the most. The IC channel, or your finite channel, is going to be your timing channel. And that reason why it's that curve at phase 4 is because that's going to kind of stay open and leak out until you finally reach a point of depolarization, which is denoted by that dotted line. You'll also have 2 calcium channels. The blue calcium channel is responsible for some of that, the ICAL, which you'll also see in the cardiac myocyte later on, is responsible for that increase in that potential, and that stays open so that you don't have depolarization again. And then also you have that potassium channel as well, which will also, which I drew kind of above in the green, instead of down with the other channels, which will help extend and slow down some of that repolarization before you can depolarize again. Next, you'll go from your SA node to your AV node to your bundle of His, and then that's when you start having your fast action potentials. And so the fast action potential has a different shape. It has a flat phase 4 and a very steep phase 0 compared to the slower phase 0 in the slow action potential. you'll also have different channels that you'll care about for different phases of it. So if you note, I kind of drew similar colors for phase 1, 2, 3 for your different channels below. And that's because those are the predominant channels that have that characteristic that will cause the fast action potential to have that characteristic. So you have your sodium channel in the purple for the phase 1, and then you also have your ICAL again for phase 2, which is going to help extend the duration of that action potential so that you don't fire again too soon. And you also have your KS, your potassium S channel for starting for phase 3, as well as your KR or potassium kind of think R is resuming to help extend as that repolarization so that you don't have desynced ventricular contractions. Because again, if you don't like delay the action potentials firing, you may cause arrhythmias basically where your ventricles don't contract in a coordinated fashion. Therefore, your heart doesn't pump in a effective manner, and you can have conditions like AFib or ventricular fib where they can be potentially life-threatening. But that's for FOM5. Those fast action potentials have two paths they can go through. As you can see, can go to the right bundle to the septal marginal tract, or your left posterior bundle to Purkinje fibers as well. But that's self-explanatory there. Some notes I'll also have are that there's an absolute refractory period and a relative refractory period. And so the absolute refractory period spans most of phase 2. That's when your heart will not, under any circumstance, depolarize under those conditions. Whereas the relative refractory period, it can. That cardiomyocyte can depolarize, but it's not really going to spread to the other cardiac myocytes. If you also note, I drew LQT3, 1, and 2 for the different different channels. And so those are the channels that you're concerned about when you have long QT symptoms or syndromes. I'm not really going to go too much into those, but those are always good to know and good to keep in mind as to the characteristics of why those different channels will have different properties based off of what phase you're kind of dealing with. Next, if we go to the left a little bit, we can talk about the cardiac myocytes. So when you do have depolarization, remember I said that you have calcium L channels that are also known as DHP channels, but I like calcium Ls better, that you're dealing with. So once those are open, those will actually let that influx of calcium in that not just only has to do with the action potential, but also has to do with contractility of the cell itself. So the calcium will go through the open channels, go to ryanine channels or RYR, which will open up, allow more calcium to escape from the endoplasmic reticulum, which stores a bunch of calcium. So this super influx of calcium will bind to your tropomyosin C. So you'll have different subunits of TN. So you have your TNC and TNI. I would say inhibitory because that'll cause more relaxation. And I would say is more for contracting. And so as that binds, then the tropomyosin will kind of unwind a little bit to expose more of that actin. So then you can have more myosin and actin linkages to cause contractions. And then if we want to go up, also note that some of the circa will reuptake some of the calcium down below into the endoplasmic reticulum. And so that's also part of regulation, which we will talk about after I talk about some of the changes that you have for pumping. So going up again, thank you, Chris. As you contract, you go into systole. And so I kind of link that to the pressure volume changes. So on that graph, you have two different lines. The lines are the green for systole and the magenta for diastole. This is because your cardiac cells have kind of different properties during systole and diastole. And so the volume and the pressure means that it's the relationship of the two. For the green one, for example, if your contractility goes down, that means you're going to be less effective at squeezing. So you're going to actually need to have more pressure to exert more volume. And so that results in a steeper curve because your pressure will go up, but you won't eject as much volume. Versus if your contractility goes up, your curve becomes less steep because you can do less pressure for more volume. And the same is seen for diastole. In diastole, you don't have as much contractility as you see in the systole. So that's why the graph's all the way to the right, because more pressure, that there's that different relationship of pressure and volume because you're not trying to contract, you're trying to relax. Um, let's see. Yeah, as your compliance decreases and your diastole increases, your compliance increase means your compliance decreasing means um, that you should be able to fill more volume with less pressure. Moving on to stroke volume up above. Um, the black line is kind of like your base venous return, and contractility can also shift that curve to the left or to the right, or kind of like up and down and as well. But as you see, the right shift means that you kind of have a less steep curve versus the left shift, which is a more steep curve. Um, the LV EDV is your left ventricular end diastolic volume. And so when you have a higher end diastolic volume, you're going to increase the tension in the preload and increase the preload, which increases the stretch and tension, which opens up more calcium L channels. And so if you see the blue line, it's kind of confusing, but the blue line means that your graph will go more to the, or your point will go more to the left along whatever curve you're talking about. And then the orange will be the curve you will have it at point more left of the curve if you have a lower preload, which means less stretch, less tension, less stroke volume as a result. If your contractility goes up again, you'll be able to have more of a stroke volume for less end diastolic volume. And then for less contractility, you will have a lower stroke volume for more end diastolic volume. Next, I'm just going to talk, before I talk about the volume loop, cardiac output and or venous return. And so in that graph sorry for anyone that's green colorblind, the graph with the venous and the cardiac lines. So those are the lines of your venous return and your cardiac output. And so that like point where they meet is going to be where you're basically working pressure is. And so the x-axis being your right atrial pressure, you can change the relationship by having either change in afterload, change in heart rate, or change in inotropy. So the green curve, for example, is where you have either decreased afterload or increased heart rate or inotropy. And the reason why that shifts up is because if you have less afterload, for example, you will push against less pressure. Therefore, you can push more volume because you have less to resist. Or if your heart rate and inotropy goes up, you will have a relationship, which I will talk about later, where you can have stronger contractions and therefore pump out more blood for less pressure and you're more efficient. And then the same is the opposite. If your afterload goes up, you have more pressure to resist, and therefore you'll be pumping out less blood. Therefore, your cardiac output and venous return decrease, as well as your heart rate inotropy decreases. You're just going to pump less. Cardiac output and venous return is a lot less for the same amount of pressure. There's also some relationships. So cardiac output is the relationship of multiplying your heart rate times the pressure of your aorta. Then you also have stroke volume, which in times the pressure of your aorta, which is stroke work. And so cardiac output and stroke work both involve the pressure of the aorta, but if you multiply all three components of stroke volume, aortic pressure, and heart rate, you'll have your cardiac minute work, or how much work your heart is doing in a minute to pump out all that blood. Now, if we kind of go to the left a little bit, right a little bit, my bad. If you see the EDV into the ESV underneath the cardiac minute work, that should be kind of like closing the loop. I kind of tried to match that to the EKG where you have, go from diastole to systole to diastole again. So let's focus on the changes in the loop from ESV to EDV. So your end systolic volume Um, that can have different changes. So if we say the volume's on the x-axis below, which I didn't draw a graph here, pressure's on a y-axis. Starting with the black line, that's your base. So if you have, let's say, a decrease in afterload, again, we talked about this. That means you can have, um, you can pump more blood out, right? And so if you notice that left shift in that curve, your end systolic volume will go down because you're able to squeeze out more of that blood from the ventricle, and therefore um, have a higher cardiac output. Your end diastolic volume should also shift to the left just because um, with that decreased afterload, that usually means the pressure is less in your peripheral arterial and venous system. So you'll have more pooling of that blood there. So less of it will reach your heart and therefore your end diastolic volume drops. The same is true for afterload, where, well, at least for end systolic volume, where if you have an increase in afterload, you're going to push out less volume. And so you'll end up with more volume. So that red shifting to the right means that you'll end up with a higher endosystolic volume. And then your end diastolic volume should mostly be unchanged, but you could also argue that since you're not pulling as much, potentially pulling more, but generally not. Um, in changing your preload curves, so your preload, if you have more preload, again, if you remember, I talked about having more preload increases stretch, tension, more cardiac L channel opens, more contractility. You will be able to have use more pressure because you have more contractility to pump. And so if you have more pressure, you pump out more, your end diastolic volume is going to increase because you have more venous return due to more cardiac output. Now, if your preload drops, you won't be able to pump out as much. So as you see, the pressure goes down in that orange curve of the preload, but then also your end diastolic volume decreases because you're just not pumping out as much. And so now that we've talked about those changes, if we go to the right just a little bit, we briefly touched on mean arterial pressure. So this small graph is the relationship between cardiac output and mean arterial pressure. So the more cardiac output you have, the more you pump along that line going to the right, the higher your arterial pressure is going to be. Because if you think about it, if you kind of spit water out through a straw a little slower, you're going to meet less resistance versus if you try to like blow out a lot of pressure really fast through a straw. You can also have changes in that relationship. So if your total peripheral resistance increases, then that means you're going to have more pressure to push against. And if your TPR drops, you'll have less pressure to push against. So your mean arterial pressure will also drop. Um, so mean arterial pressure is calculated by multiplying cardiac output times TPR. Another way to calculate that is using your diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of your PP of your pulse pressure, which is going to be your systolic minus diastolic blood pressure. And those are good relationships to know for the exam as well. Hopefully they didn't change that. If you could zoom out a little bit for me, please. And let's go to the autonomic nervous system part really quick. And you can stay zoomed there. And actually go to the left a little bit. Keep that zoom levels perfect. So I kind of drew the peripheral nervous system over the ACH and then SNS with norepinephrine and epinephrine. So we'll talk specifically about beta 1 because beta 1, one heart, beta 2, two lungs, but we won't get there for smooth muscle. If we start with not peripheral nervous, parasympathetic nervous system, it will release ACH, which goes to your M2 receptors, and that will inhibit GS. And so inhibiting GS inhibits that favorite cascade of adenylyl cyclase, CAMP, and PKA. So what do CAMP and PKA do? They can affect your dromotropy and your chromotropy and your inotropy. Dromotropy means the timing of the like how fast the action potentials go, because the faster you complete an action potential, the faster you can restart it. Chronotropy is timing. The faster chronotropy means faster contractions, and inotropy is the strength of your contraction. More inotropic, more strength. So, and then also, since we're on this topic, why not? Norepinephrine will be the one acting on beta 1, which will increase GS, increase AC, more CAMP, more PKA. So CAMP, what it'll do is it specifically more increases your chronotropy by binding to your ICs channels or your funny channels. So the more open they are, the faster they leak, the faster you will the depolarization stage, and the more steep your phase 4 curve will be. Therefore, faster heart rate. PKA in particular will increase your dromotropy and your inotropy. PKA will phosphorylate your calcium channels, your L channels, and increase how fast they're open, and therefore let that leak in faster and shorten the duration of your refractory period. It'll also do that in your cardiac myocytes to let in more calcium, and therefore, again, letting in more calcium into the cardiac myocyte will increase your contractility strength. Also, note there's some relationships between heart rate and contractility that I touched upon. When your calcium L channels open up in your cardiac myocytes, that'll let in more calcium. And the more often they open, the more often calcium leaks in. And so that will lead to, again, stronger contractions, and that will be called your Bowditch effect, where your chromatropy affects your inotropy. Another effect that you should know is your Frank-Starling effect, where again, I touched on this with preload. The more you stretch your cells, the more your channels open up, lets in more calcium, stronger contractions. Before I forget, two more, sorry that this is kind of unorganized, but two more effects that PKA have are that it'll phosphorylate both TNI as well as circa. So what happens when it phosphorylates TNI is it has less inhibition on the contractility of the cells through tropomyosin and actin, in particular for circa. So circa reuptakes calcium. So you would think, but if it reuptakes calcium, wouldn't that make it have less calcium in the cells to act on the actin myosin? But what it actually does is if you have a higher concentration of calcium in the endoplasmic reticulum, you have a more explosive release, and therefore you'll have more available calcium for contractions. Alrighty, I think that's that part. We can move on to the smooth muscle. So if you want to just go to the middle part real quick. So again, I talked about smooth muscle for beta 1, beta 2, because lung is mostly smooth muscle, but let's talk more about how that works. You'll start with calcium release when you have depolarization. And so stretch can cause those channels to open up. If you zoom in a little bit more towards the circa B, so we can ignore the endothelium a little bit because that might be a little confusing. Thank you. Calcium opens up. Again, it's similar to cardiac myocytes, to RYR, that opens up more calcium. Calcium binds to calmodulin. So what does inhibits CGMP? And so calmodulin, what that does is it activates myosin light chain kinase, which will phosphorylate your myosin light chain on your myosin. And when that's activated, it'll bind more to your actin and do your cross-bridge cycle. CGMP inhibited means less activation of myosin light chain phosphorylase cleaving phosphates, opposite of kinase. So it inactivates MLC, less cross-bridge. CGMP, I like to have a little fun way of remembering that CGMP, you give up, you don't want to contract anymore. So if you want to use that as a little fun way to remember that, kind of depressing, but we do what works for us. PKG is also involved in the activation of MLCP as well, as a fun fact, but those are just multiple ways of causing relaxation. So again, MLCK kinase for contraction, and CGMP give up dilation because you're not contracting. You also should know that there's calponin. So instead of tropomyosin and having the other TNs, you'll have caldesmin instead on smooth muscle, but you also have the calponin, which is associated with the caldesmin. And I kind of tried to draw that in the blue and the black. Calponin will inhibit the myosin ATPase, which will decrease contraction. So that's a way to regulate having contraction and not contracting constantly. Um, You'll also know I wrote dilation and constriction will lead to flow changes. And so that means it can affect not just your lungs which have smooth muscle, but you have smooth muscle everywhere in your arteries. And we'll talk more about that with the kidney. But if you want to go down just a little bit, there's some other ways that smooth muscle can be and zoom out maybe a little bit, please, regulated. So again, PNS and SNS. Let's start with the PNS, the parasympathetics. You'll have your acetylcholine, which binds to your M3 receptor, which will increase the nitric oxide being made, which will stimulate more CGMP. And again, CGMPs give up, don't contract. But the interesting exception is that heat, which is a sympathetic reflex, will actually go through kind of like the sympathetic pathway. So it'll go to ACH to M2, which will stimulate NOS or nitric oxide synthase, which will increase your NO and therefore more relaxation. You also have different effects in your endothelium that will cause release of calcium and therefore stimulate NOS and COX-2. And so mechanotransduction, release of ACTP, ACTH, histamines, bradykinin will stimulate the calcium release, stimulate those, cause more relaxation. PGI2 also will inhibit the formation of CAMP. So that's why having that COX is important. And then the reason why I think COX will inhibit NOS is to kind of have some sort of regulation of dilation as well. Not super important to know, but just know that there is a relationship between COX-2 and NOS. Even though they seem to be doing the same action, you kind of have to have some regulation of that action. For sympathetics, you'll have your alpha-1 and your beta-2. So for alpha-1, what that'll do is activate GQ, which will release IP3, which will bind to a receptor on the sarcoplasmic reticulum and release more calcium. Also to note that the alpha-1 will also activate Rho kinase, which will inhibit MLCP, which means less dilation. Also note that smooth muscle also has circa 2B instead of just circa like cardiomyocytes. As for beta-2, that'll have epinephrine release to it, GS to AC to C camp to PKA, our favorite triad. The camp will, both the camp and the PKA will inhibit MLCK and therefore less contraction, more relaxation. And that makes sense for if you're trying to have increased breathing, for example, whereas the alpha-1 makes more sense for arteries where you want to constrict them more to increase blood pressure. So now let's go to the lungs. So the lungs, I don't know as well, but it should synthesize a lot of what a lot of the physiology talked about. I know there's more to it. Obviously, again, I didn't fit everything on here. Use this as a reference to understand relationships. So starting with the lungs, you have 3 different zones, zone 1, 2, and 3. And so the reason why that they divide it into different zones is because there's different relationships between V and Q, also known as your ventilation and your perfusion. Ventilation being the exchange of gas with blood and perfusion being the flow of blood. So let's start with zone 1. So here I've drawn alveoli in the circles, but you also have arteries that run within the alveoli. And so when you are breathing, what actually happens is those alveoli will stretch. And as those physically stretch, they will also physically pull on the arteries and stretch them out and cause them to pump blood out. Because you'll have delivered that blood. Actually, wait, no. No, it stretches them out and pulls blood in and opens them up more. And then when you breathe out, you increase pressure on your alveoli, and therefore it's going to contract and squeeze those arteries and therefore squeeze that blood away. So there's that relationship of how you can passively perfuse your alveoli. So when you're exhaling, more pressure, squeezed arteries, less blood going to there. You don't want to perfuse our alveoli that don't have oxygenated blood, which makes sense for exhalation. Um, so then on the left side, when you're inhaled, your VQs will be different values. You'll average a 1, but the reason why your VQ is higher up above is because you have more ventilation versus perfusion. Why is the perfusion lower than the ventilation? It's because you have less hydrostatic pressure in those arteries, and therefore, it's harder to pump upwards, right? It's easier to pump downwards. So you'll just have less blood going to the upper parts of your lungs. That probably changes if you're dangling yourself upside down, but we're not going to talk about that. In the middle of your lungs, you're going to have more of a match of a 1-to-1 ratio, which means you're going to have the most efficient um, blood exchange for blood perfusion. It's 1-to-1 again because you have more hydrostatic pressure. You have more blood pooling in the center versus of your lungs versus the top. And at the bottom, your VQ will be the lowest because you'll have way more perfusion because you'll have way more blood going into the lower parts of your lung just because it'll pool down there versus up high. And also as a result of that difference in pressure, you'll also have you'll see I draw in different pressures in the zone 1. So the P capital A will be alveolar pressure, P lowercase a is arterial, PV is venous. In zone 1, since you have the least hydrostatic pressure, your arterial and venous pressure are both going to be lower than your alveolar pressure or the pressure of the air on the arteries or the alveoli on the arteries. And then as you go down, as you know, arterial pressure is always going to be greater than venous. That relationship with the alveoli changes. So zone 2, you'll have more hydrostatic pressure. Your alveolar pressure will be less than your arterial pressure. In zone 3, your alveolar pressure will be less than your alveolar and venous pressures. As you Something I also drew is anatomic dead space. And so knowing anatomic dead space, this is kind of going to relate to more ventilation. And perfusion means that there's no perfusion of, of that alveoli just because you can't perfuse everywhere, right? So there's not going to be gas exchange there. How does this relate to VQ? So let's say, or did I say alveolar dead space? I meant anatomic dead space. So that's just normal because you're not always going to perfuse everything. When you want to think more about relationships of VQs with disorders, so like alveolar dead space, for example, that's going to have an infinite VQ. What is alveolar dead space? Basically, you lose a lot of perfusion to your alveoli for some reason, whether that can be from, let's say, um, shunting blood away, right? You have, what's it called? You're going to learn a lot more about this, the like tetralogy of Fallot, where you have blood going to your other part of your heart instead of to your lungs. You're basically going to have no perfusion, but all the ventilation and therefore it's going to be near infinite because the bottom denominator will basically be nil. For pulmonary shunts, that'll be 0 because you don't have any exchange of gas, but you have all the perfusion. What are some conditions you can think of with pulmonary shunts? You can think of fibrosis. There's damage to your lungs. You can think of emphysema, for example, causing some of that damage where you have less efficient, you just basically have damage and that doesn't allow for gas to cross the alveoli. So just think about what conditions, because they'll ask a lot of questions of, okay, they have this condition. How is this going to affect their artery to alveolar oxygen ratio? And so as you see with the pulmonary shunt, I wrote that it's going to increase that ratio because if you don't have that exchange, that gradient of oxygen across is going to be higher instead of equalizing. Some other notes, if you see the Z, Y, and X, those are going to be like a relationship of pressures of what happens when you're exhaling. So the left, I kind of drew more inhaling. The right, I drew more exhaling. When you exhale, you're going to have a pressure again that squeezes the arteries, which I kind of try to draw contracting to decrease wasted perfusion because you don't want to perfuse areas that aren't going to get oxygen. And so your pressure will actually drop as you go farther up the airway. And so eventually you'll reach a point called the equal pressure point where your pressure inside the alveoli equals the pressure from your lungs, your interstitial, I believe. And it's this pressure gradient that kind of drives air outwards. And so your Z will still be the least pressure though, because it's going to kind of be more analogous to the barometric pressure. So, but no, specifically, it's that Y, that equal pressure point. That's going to be the main driving pressure. You might want to say it's X, but in reality, it's that Y because if you think about it, it's still kind of dilated towards the X part of the pressure. So there's more forces acting on the alveoli itself versus at Y where the alveoli aren't going to move, right? There's no force on the alveoli. There's no net force. The alveoli is not going to move. So that's going to focus all out energy towards the air going out towards pressure Z. Um, and down below, I kind of drew inhalation, exhalation again. So B pressure barometric is going to be greater than IP and PA pressure. So IP being intrapulmonary, I believe, versus the PA, which is alveolar, which makes sense because when you're inhaling, right, you want to have your pressure be lowest inside your alveoli so that the air will go in. Your PVR also goes down because your peripheral vascular resistance goes down as your arteries dilate, which means it's easier for blood to flow into them. PVR goes up in exhalation because again, don't want to waste perfusion there. As you vasoconstrict, it's harder to pump blood into there. Next, if we go to the left, we'll quickly talk about obstructive and restrictives. So we'll have our volume flow loop, which the black is the baseline, and then you'll have either obstructive or restrictive diseases causing a difference in the loop. So that loop, when it's above zero means air is flowing in. When it's below zero, air is flowing out. So as you follow that curve, your 50% of your functional residual capacity will equal what was mean expiratory force. So when you reach 50% functional residual capacity, that's going to be the average of the is that sorry, my bad. This is one thing I forgot to review. MEF. Is that mean expiratory force? Mean flow volume loop? Peak expiratory. Okay, so it's yeah, mean inspiratory and expiratory force. So actually, I believe I made an error. So the inspiration should be going to the left and the exhalation is going to the right. So that's why that doesn't make sense. So Krystle, if you could just like erase the inhale and the exhale just for me, just
Yeah.
temporarily.
So there should be, yeah, inspiration on the bottom, expiration on the top. And then Alan, just make sure, did you mean that restrictive was the orange and obstructive was the magenta?
Is that also the case?
Just because of what I'm basing off of, like, from first aid. Because if you have an obstructive, you should have more air, unless you're drawing it as like
This is
which,
just the flow loop. It's not necessarily the uh, volumes. Let me double check that real quick on.
because if you're doing, well, unless your diagram is flipped from theirs, then I would say obstructive, then it's correct. Just because obstructive, you should have more volume. and restrictive, you should have less. Unless yours is flipped from theirs.
Obstructive. Always good to know. I am not infallible. Okay. Actually, no, that should be correct.
Okay, just make
Based off of something else that I have. Okay. So the reason, but I can try and do my best to explain. So with obstructive lung disease, what happens is not necessarily that you're having a restriction on um, how much air you have, but rather obstructing the flow. So that's why, so if the x-axis is the volume, the y-axis is the flow. With obstructive, your flow is going to be affected. So that's where you have that coving, which is characteristic of an obstructive lung disease, but you're going to still reach the full volume of air that you can breathe versus a restrictive disease where for some reason you have, let's say, fibrosis. You can't get your lungs to expand as much. So the flow is not necessarily as effective. So as you see, the flow reaches a higher peak for exhalation, but inspire, but uh, well, the pressures aren't as affected, but your amount that you're able to breathe is restricted. And so below, I kind of drew the relationship of FEV1 versus FVC, FEV1 being your forced expiratory volume in 1 second versus your functional vital capacity. That should be what that stands for. Um, is that what FEC stands for? I believe so. But if that ratio is greater or lesser, that will determine whether you're obstructive or restrictive. So if it's greater than 0.7, that means you're able to expire a lot in 1 second, which means you're not having an obstruction versus obstructive, where if you are expelling less than 0.7% or 70% of the air in 1 second, then you have an obstruction that's kind of getting in the way of pushing that air out. And so then you can use that one flow chart there to determine whether you have obstructive or restrictive diseases. To the left of that, I kind of drew your lung volumes and the relationships that they have. So there should be technically a line between IRV and TV, or your inspiratory reserve volume, and your tidal volume. Tidal volume being just the normal air you breathe in versus IRC, which is the additional air you can breathe. IRC and TV equals inspiratory capacity, how much you can inspire. ERV is expiratory reserve volume, how much extra air from baseline you can breathe out. Functional residual capacity is just the total amount of air you can expire. The total amount of air you have in your lungs from baseline. You also have your vital capacity, the total amount of air you can inspire from full expiration. And then TLC is just total lung, it's all of those. So on the sides, I drew obstructive and restrictive and how that changes your actual total lung capacity. And so again, your total lung capacity will go all the way down because with restriction, you're just restricting how much air you can breathe in versus obstructive. The interesting thing is it actually increases how much air you can hold because if you have an obstruction of letting air out, you're just going to keep trapping that air in. And so you have conditions like COPD, for example, where you have the barrel chested. I may have misspoken in saying emphysema is restrictive. It's trapping, but I was misconstruing that with like fibrosis. If you want to zoom up just a little bit after you finish your little annotations with notes, pay attention to Krystle's notes. These are all very important things that, again, I can't fit everything on there. So she's doing you the wonder of adding stuff in.
Oh, also, Alan, sorry, I didn't want to mean to interrupt you earlier. FVC is forced vital capacity. I'm not sure if you said it.
Forced vital capacity. Thank you.
And then, sorry, where did you want me to?
They're just there.
Okay.
Um, Next is just that loop there. So you have your TLC and vital capacity on the y-axis, and this is just showing the relationship of pressure and like how much air you have in your lungs. And so when you go up in pressure, when you inhale, CW means chest wall, L means lung, and then L plus chest wall is like the pressure of both. Your chest wall, you want to stay negative because it'll pull on your lungs, um, and cause them to allow you to inhale, versus the lungs themselves, they want to contract. And so that's why they're going to have a positive pressure on the airway, because they want to like kind of squeeze down, but the chest wall's not letting them. So a note that's important to have is that at 50%, um, around, I think it was 55, or no, it was 70% of TLC, your functional, or no, it is 50%. Yeah, 50%, which is your FRC, your pressures are going to be slightly positive. And why is that? It's positive because when you're inhaling normally, um, you, you have a little bit of positive pressure to allow you to exhale, but that you're not exhaling air in that instance because you have muscles causing the lungs to stay stretched and therefore still have that positive pressure on the airway. Um, Also note the sad face for the chest wall is when that chest wall pressure, instead of being negative, is zero, it's not no longer pulling on your lungs in that negative vacuum almost, and therefore you're going to have pneumothorax when your lungs collapse. On the left of that, I drew some pulmonary equations that are good for you to know. I'm not going to read them all out to you. Also, I wrote some air, like, what's the word? Components of air, which you should know for the exam. One thing I'll note that I found particularly important is to know the PaCO2 times 0.03 will equal your bicarb, and this will be important later on. All right, if you want to go to the kidneys now, I believe we are, go up.
So, did you already talk about the
I
O2
will talk
filter?
about this last usually,
Okay,
because this kind of goes into the relationship of everything.
seems good.
All right, everyone's favorite, the kidney. Now, this is not midterm material. So if you're at the midterm, ignore this unless they've changed this in future. And I don't think, if they pass this video down, which I hope they don't. Um, so ignore this for the midterm. Uh, Pay attention to this for the final. This will be very important for the final and knowing the relationships of everything. So we'll start with this huge mess. We have if you want to start with efferent, afferent in the glomerulus, if you see that triangle up there, you'll have fluid going from your afferent to your glomerulus to your efferent. 80% of that fluid will go back to the efferent, but 20% of it will be filtered in your nephron. And so your nephron, I've kind of divided into your different divisions, your early and late PCT, descending loop of Henle, thin ascending loop of Henle, thick ascending loop of Henle, early and late DCT, and then your collecting duct. I'm not going to go over every single transporter. Just know that on the inside of the lumen will be the apical side, and then the other side will be the basolateral side. And so let's start with the PCT though for some fun facts. SGLT2, why is that super important? That will intake most of the glucose in your blood. PCT, there's no regulation here because everything is just automatic. And so SGLT2, again, will take up most of your glucose. Later on, SGLT1 will pick up the slack on whatever it misses. You will basically be able to reabsorb all the glucose because up to about 180 milligrams or grams per deciliter, whatever that measurement is, which is increased in diabetes, which is why you will have urine with sugar in diabetes because you exceed the maximum transport capacity. You'll also reabsorb most of your electrolytes, most of your sodium in here. There's also some paracellular kind of reabsorption as you have NAK channels. If you see the little rectangles in the, what is that called? Yeah, lateral intercellular space. You also have acid-base balance as well, where I kind of drew a cell with the relationship of glutamine going to glutaminase, going to alpha ketoglutarate, which will make NH3, which is pumped out to capture protons um, and keep it in the PCT, but also reabsorb uh, bicarb by making protons that will capture the bicarb. So ammonia, the NHE3 will capture protons, but the proton will capture bicarb, and there'll be another uh, carbonic anhydrase to convert that CO2 and H2O back to um, convert the bicarb and the potassium into H2O and CO2 so it can be reabsorbed and reconverted and reabsorbed through NECBE1. In the descending, it's water permeable, salt insoluble, and then in the around the thin ascending loop of Henle, it's salt permeable but water insoluble. Once you reach your TLAH, there are all those transporters I'll let you look at there. The important one to know is NKCC, and I'll talk about the relationship of that and all the other ones downstream when we talk more about meds. Um, Something to note in the macula densa, which is kind of, I think, controversial apparently where it is in the nephron, but for our sake, let's just say it's here. So what that does is it senses the sodium levels. And so and why does it do that? It uses that as like a proxy for calculating what your GFR is. Because if your GFR is slower, that means you'll spend more time in the early PCT. And like I said, hell absorbs electrolytes. Therefore, you'll have fewer electrolytes. If you have lower GFR, therefore less sodium. Macula densa senses that. And we'll talk more about regulation later. In the DCT, you'll have your principal cells, which are deal a lot with regulation, and I'll talk about that in a moment. You'll also have in your collecting duct your alpha intercalateds and your beta intercalateds. Alpha intercalateds secrete acid, A for acid, beta intercalateds secrete base, or B for base. The collecting duct is also important because this is where you have concentration of your urine. It has urea transporters, which will carry water with it. And the more water you take out, the more it'll concentrate your urine as well. So let's talk about some regulation. Again, so starting with, there's a lot here. So it's important to know the relationship of all these and how to affect things downstream. Starting again with the macula densa. If you have low GFR, reabsorb more electrolytes early, low sodium. When the GAA activates, what it'll do is it will do a few things to kind of increase your GFR because it's your kidneys want to filter at a certain rate. So what it'll do is if you have GFR, let's say again you have that drop, it'll actually release renin. And if you see that magenta line going to renin, what does renin do? Renin will help convert angiotensin, which is made by your liver, and convert angiotensin to angiotensin 1. Then you also have ACE in your lungs, which will convert that 1 to angiotensin 2. And it's the 2 that really has those effects. So angiotensin 2 will bind to AT1, which will help increase NAK ATPase in your PCT. So that's kind of like an exception. As well as NHE3. The more sodium you reabsorb, the more water that'll follow it. And therefore, you will increase your blood pressure, and more pressure means more GFR because you're going to push more water through the nephron. What it'll also do is it constrict your efferent um, vessels. And so how does that affect your GFR? Well, if you back up the efferents, blood's trying to leave, you're going to increase pressure in the glomerulus, and therefore you're going to increase GFR. Now, this happens up to a certain point where you have about 50% constriction, where your GFR will actually start to decrease, because if you're not letting blood out, you're not going to let as much blood in to the nephron. Um, what that'll also do for angiotensin is it'll bind to AT1s in the adrenals and the brain, which will release aldosterone and ADH respectively. If you zoom out just well, if you follow that blue line, we'll start with aldosterone. Aldosterone will bind to, if you follow it all the way to the DCT and this collecting duct, ADHV2 on the principal cells, as well as actually, no, my bad. Aldosterone will bind to MR, or mineralocorticoid receptor. My bad. Only so much room I can draw stuff in. Sometimes a mistake that I didn't find somewhere. So aldosterone to MR. What MR will do is it will activate XGK1, which will increase expression and translocate or transportation. It'll basically move more ENaC onto the membrane, and therefore increase sodium reuptake. What it'll also do is it'll increase expression of HATPase. This kind of seems random, but this does come back to acid-base balance when you are in second year for pathology. But for now, just know that it'll increase HATPase, something that me and Krystle have thought about, which we haven't confirmed. But one reason why we think it might do this is because if you increase HATPase, the HKATPase will have a harder time pumping protons out. If it does that, have a harder time with that, it'll reabsorb less potassium. If there's if there's more, it'll reabsorb less potassium, keeping it in the lumen. More potassium in the lumen will make it harder to pump ROM-K out. And if there's more potassium in the principal cells, the NAK-ATPase on the basolateral side will have a harder time pumping, and therefore affect that transport. Not confirmed, but just again, think about those relationships. Let me think. What else? If you go up, zoom out just a little bit, please, and go up to the top. Like, just zoom out a little so we can see the relationship of the brown and blue lines. So ADH will bind to ADHV2, which will increase your favorite pathway of AC to CAMP to PKA. Well, that'll do is increase ENaC as well, but also increase aquaporin 2. Aquaporin 3 and 4 are always there. They're not regulated, but aquaporin 2 is. So if you change the levels of that, you'll change how much water you'll reabsorb. And again, water falls salt. So that's why you'll have the salt reabsorption, therefore water reabsorption as well. ADH will also increase your NKCC expression, therefore more water, salt, more water, as well as constrict your sphincter of the vasa recta. And so if you go down just a little bit, please. The vasa recta, if you constrict the sphincters there, what does that do? That will slow down the flow of blood through the vasa recta, which surround your nephrons. Why is that important? If you slow that down, you increase reabsorption of salts, therefore increase reabsorption of water. It'll also increase urea transporters because, again, like I said, this is where you concentrate your urine. More urea transport in, more water reabsorption. Something important to note, as I begin to talk about acid regulation here, actually, yeah. As we talk about reabsorption, is that a lot of these channels will affect potassium reabsorption. And what your cells like to do in your body is exchange potassium and protons. So if you increase the potassium in your body, you're going to try and your pH is going to drop because your body will be like, okay, we have a lot of potassium. Let's take some of it in and pump out protons to try and keep that balance. and therefore your pH will drop. If you have low potassium, your body will be like, I want to pump out some potassium from my cells into the blood. And this is, again, just through general cells in your body, not just nephron. So then your cells will be like, okay, pump out that potassium, but that means I have to pull in that hydrogen as an exchange. So then it'll raise your serum pH. And therefore, that's how you can cause acidosis and alkalosis. Or let me think, what other regulation? Let's say if you also note that there's a beta 1 on the JGA, beta 1 stimulation will actually cause release of renin as well. And that will also affect your glomerular filtration rate. As as you can see, also there's a balance of GFR. If it increases, I kind of drew an arrow where dotted arrow from the increased GFR will release adenosine from the JGA if your renal perfusion is higher. And so what does adenosine do? It'll constrict your afferent, which will drop your GFR. And because there's less blood going to it. But then if that drops, then you're actually going to decrease the amount of adenosine you release and potentially increase your renin. So there's a lot of relationships there that you can think about. Also of note, fun fact, if you have hyperkalemia, what that'll do is it'll activate your zona glomerularis with zonula glomerularis, which will depolarize, which will increase your calcium release, which will release aldosterone eventually, which will have the aforementioned effects I mentioned before. Let's see, any other fun facts before I start getting into relationships? Just in time for Valentine's Day. Okay, so I kind of touched upon, I think to start with relationships, I think I might even talk about medications. So let's start with our diuretics. So we have different types of diuretics. Your carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, loop diuretics, thiazides, aldosterone antagonists, and your sodium blockers. So starting with the carbonic anhydrase, that's going to do is it's going to inhibit carbonic anhydrase, which means you will make and reabsorb less bicarbonate. What does that do? If you have less bicarbonate in your urine, if you have more bicarbonate in your urine, reabsorbing less of it into your blood, that's going to increase your urine pH. And why is that helpful? If you think way down the line at the collecting duct, at your alpha intercalateds, you see you have a bunch of proton pumps. If there's fewer protons, that means there's less of a gradient to push against, and therefore they're going to be more effective at pumping, which means you're going to reabsorb more potassium. If you reabsorb more potassium at the alpha intercalateds, that means the principal cells might have an easier time with your ROM-K pumping out potassium. And if it pumps out more potassium, that means that NAK, NATPase can will have less leak actually, so that it will work less, and therefore it'll keep the sodium in your blood, and therefore in your not in your blood, in your urine, and therefore you'll pee out more water because water follows sodium. Loop diuretics in particular will inhibit NKCC. And so NKCC will have several different effects. One, it'll, less sodium reabsorption, less water, but also if you have less potassium reabsorption, you will have less potassium to escape out ROM-K. And why is ROM-K important? As you probably hopefully know, that ROM-K leakage will create small micro like charges that will cause you to reabsorb calcium and magnesium paracellularly. So if you don't have that micro positive charge, you don't reabsorb calcium and magnesium, you can become hypomagnesic or hypocalcemic as well. Also, thiazide diuretics will inhibit NCC. As it inhibits NCC, that means you're going to change. There's a balance between CA-ATPase, ECAC, NCX, NCC, and NAK. So with that balance, if you have less sodium going into cells, that means on the apical side, that means the NCX on the basolateral side will have a better time of working, and therefore pump in more sodium, and therefore also affect your calcium levels by pumping out more calcium and letting you absorb more calcium. So you can have high calcium levels as well. Uh, with the high, so yeah, that's why I drew like the plus arrow to the calcium, because you will increase that calcium reabsorption through pumping out NCX. Uh, Also, I wrote that if you have increased sodium in there, then you also have increased potassium out. And so that has to do with the NAK ATPase. And so if you are able to have more sodium in through NCX, you can also pump out more protons through that potassium through the NAK. Uh, Next, I will talk about your aldosterone agonists and your NA blockers, which are finally your potassium sparing. Everything we talked about was potassium wasting. And again, we care about potassium because of heart rate and heart stuff. Um, your aldosterone agonists, antagonists, spironolactone eplerenone will block ADH, which will block the aforementioned effects of increasing AQP2 and ENaC expression. NA blockers will block just ENaC, which will, again, less water in, means you reabsorb less water, you'll pee it out. Um, Something to note while we're there is you'll have cortisol and cortisone, which 11 beta, 11 BSD, I think it should be BHSD, but that will inactivate your cortisol to cortisone, so it doesn't bind to MR receptors, since sometimes cortisol can activate it. Black licorice, which has glizzy, whatever acid. Just remember the Riz acid. That's important to know for medications and interactions. They'll ask questions about that on the exam. So know that if you block that, you'll have more cortisol, more MR. That'll affect your nephrons. Okay. I think that is all the kidney relationships I have in mind. There might be more, but you can just follow the logic of, remember, everything upstream will affect things downstream. So like if I even talk about more, like let's say you have less reabsorption of sodium in the PCT or everywhere else, that's going to affect your acid base balance, because you're going to have protons pump against that positive charge of the sodium. And if you have, or potassium is especially important, actually. If you have higher potassium because of wasting diuretics, then you can have the KATPase pump out even more protons. And if it does that, then it might make you become metabolically uh, alkalemic by pumping out too many protons. Um, Speaking of, if we want to go down, um, there's a graph about well, before I talk about acid-base balance a little more, here's a bunch of renal equations that you're supposed to know. I don't know these really super well off the top of my head, but you should be able to know the relationship of urine and plasma, and how using those equations can calculate how fast you are filtering things using, your creatinine as your analog. Those are all important to know. Know how to convert between some of the equations. Uh, but I'm not going to talk too much about those, since again, I don't know them as well. And I am concerned more about the relationship of all these systems versus knowing these right now in this whiteboard. So if you zoom into that little graph of the pH and the HCO3, so this is going to deal with your metabolic and your respiratory compensation. Metabolic compensation being your kidneys regulating your pH by reabsorbing bicarb. Respiratory, you breathing out CO2, which means less bicarb. So that black line is going to be um, your baseline curve. So let's say your pH let's say your pH increases, so it's higher than 7.4. So what you want to try and um, get back to a normal pH by going along that respiratory compensation line. So you will shift to the left by breathing out more. Or if your pH drops, that means um, there you have not enough bicarb, and therefore you're going to breathe out less, and so you'll shift to the right. Metabolic compensation falls a different line, um, where if you have, let's say, a high pH, you'll um, so you'll go to the right. You'll actually have metabolic compensation by going to a line kind of upwards in that direction through absorbing more bicarb, which is that y-axis, and vice versa. If you become acidotic, um, or if you yeah you increase your pH, your metabolic compensation will actually no, your metabolic compensation will shift you to the left. My bad, decreasing your bicarb. That makes more sense. Whereas if you have a lower pH shifting to the left, your metabolic compensation will shift you to the right by increasing the amount of bicarb. That makes more sense with the y-axis. The dotted line that I drew in magenta is also your hemoglobin buffer. Proteins can act as a buffer, and so that will shift your curve to be a little more um, steeper as well, just as a fun fact. So think about that and how having more blood or less blood will change your relationship of acid and base balance. Um, if we go to the left a little bit, we're almost done. Yeah, there we go. This is just basically exchange of your blood and air. And so if you and this also has to do with acid-base balance. If you look to the left of that, I drew a dissociation curve where you have your hemoglobin saturation on the left y-axis, arterial oxygen on the x-axis. So the black line's your baseline. When you're 100% oxygenated, you're going to have a lot of saturation, 98 to 100%. 50% will be at 40, about 40, whatever pressure units is for PaO2. So the 40 and 100 are really important numbers to know because you want to know when you're pretty saturated or only half saturated. You can shift that curve through different ways. So if you have fetal hemoglobin, that'll shift the curve to the left, which means less oxygen, pressure of oxygen, more saturation. Why is that? Um, because for fetal hemoglobin, they need to steal oxygen from the mother's blood. So therefore, it'll have higher saturation at lower oxygen just so it can siphon that blood from the mother to deliver to the baby. Carbon monoxide will also do that. And that's why it kills you, because if you saturate, you're not going to let go of that oxygen. You're not going to feed your tissues. The orange curve is when you shift it to the right. That's when your pH drops. Why does your pH drop? Probably because you have more CO2. 2,3-BPG will also be released in certain conditions to help you deliver more oxygen to tissues. Why does that shifting the curve to the right mean more oxygen-free tissues? Well, it just means that you need more oxygen to saturate your hemoglobin. That means it's not going to accept it as easily because it wants to let go of that oxygen, therefore delivering it to your tissues more. Now, as we talk about delivering oxygen and carbon dioxide and acid-base balance, there are some brain things and sensory things that we can talk about as well. And this also has to do with the kidney as well. So like if you increase your bicarb from your kidneys as well, your body will sense this in different ways. Pathologically occurs. Again, shout out to Krystle for being here. We are using precious study time. I promise I'm almost done, Krystle. Is Great. Thank you, lovely student of the month. If you could go up a little bit to the brain stuff. So, so zoom in a little bit. So you have your carotid and aortic baroreceptors. So the carotid, and so you both have if you zoom in just a little bit down, do you see where I wrote extra? Yeah, perfect. The carotid sinus in body, the aortic baroreceptor in body will sense different things. So the blue is the CO2, the purple is the bicarb, and the green is the O2. So the aortic baroreceptor will go through cranial nerve 10 or your vagus. If your peripheral nervous system is increased, that means this will increase firing um, and therefore have more of an effect. The carotid sinus will also um, fire depending on what your pressure is. Um, and it senses direct pressure directly, whereas the body just does pH and PaO2. What those signals will do, it'll go to both the CVLM, the RVLM, which will affect the firing of your PNS and SNS. So let's say if your PNS is firing more, like I said, from the aortic baroreceptor, you're going to release more ACH. You're going to probably constrict your lungs and relax your blood vessels. Um, Carotid sinus, or if you increase your medullary firing, that'll affect your DRG and VRG, which will regulate whether you are inspiring or exhaling faster because, affecting if you have low pH or if you have high CO2, you're going to want to breathe a little more to get rid of that. Or also if you need more oxygen. And these are also, before I forget, they're central and peripheral. The carotid, uh, uh, central and peripheral sensing. I think I may have forgotten to draw some lines for the central. So let me just double check that really quick. Um, oh, well, I don't think this relationship is super, super important. Just know that that's how you can regulate your breathing. And also, again, I kind of connected it to our arteries again. Okay. Centrally, line I'm missing is the pH line. So why would pH affect your medulla or signal to your medulla? Your CSF in your brain is very sensitive, and so your blood turns into CSF. If you have low pressure or low pH, your brain's going to be very sensitive to that. It doesn't want to have that. And so what it'll do is it'll stimulate the medulla directly through the central pathway and therefore increase your respiration through the DRG. All right. If we also want, so also if you see the exercise, what it'll do is, so exercise increases your sympathetics. And so with your sympathetics, you're going to constrict your blood vessels. But if you're exercising, you want to have more, um, what's it called? More blood go to those vessels. So how does that work? What the exercise will do is, and also you've often heard that exercise will inhibit your, will improve your blood pressure. So what that'll do is it'll actually inhibit your carotid and aortic baroreceptors from firing. And so when it does that, it'll help open up your vessels so that you can have blood flow to the places you want to go. And that will also help you lower your blood pressure in the long run. Speaking of blood pressure, if we want to zoom all the way out just to have that little image, um, there is a cycle that you can have. The other one I will talk about is uh, cardiac failure. So if you have high blood pressure, a lot of times that'll be because of just some idiopathic reason of like you just have higher peripheral total peripheral resistance. When you have higher blood pressure, often because of those vessels, you'll have less blood flow to your kidneys. So then your kidneys are like, okay, I need to stimulate my GJA because I have less GFR, sodium's down. I'll release some renin. That renin will make AT2 eventually, which will increase the water you reabsorb, as well as constrict blood your blood vessels in your kidney. But you're already constricted, you have high blood pressure, and so your kidneys are going to be like, wait, why am I still having low what's it called? Low glomerular filtration rate. Let's release more renin. That's the cycle that happens that keeps your blood pressure high because if again, for some idiopathic reason or just because that's just how you are, you have stenosed vessels, occluded vessels, or just a lot of vascular resistance, your kidney's not going to know that difference. It only knows what it wants, not what the rest of the body wants. And so that cycle of continually release renin to constrict even further when you're already constricted will cause you to have high blood pressure that worsens and worsens. Another relationship I want to talk about is also, yeah, if you think about it, if you increase blood pressure, that can lead to fluid retention, but also increasing blood pressure will increase usually your afterload, which means you're going to continue to have more blood fill your heart. And what happens with that, you might increase your right atrial pressure just because you're having increased diastolic volume. If you increase that, what your heart will do is release ANP or BNP from your ventricles as well. What that does is it can inhibit angiotensin, renin, and ADH, and therefore hopefully drop that blood pressure by decreasing the constriction. So you do have some hope there, but what if you start with heart failure, where you have to start with the increased pressure? If you have that increased, if you have heart failure, that you have increased right atrial pressure, and you'll have high ANB and BNP. But if you have heart failure, you're also going to have decreased renal perfusion, and therefore you're going to have that cycle of renin again, where you increase renin, you increase your vasoconstriction, increase aldosterone and ADH, which will draw in more fluid. If you draw in more fluid, however, your heart can't compensate for that. And so it'll still release ANB and BNP to try and inhibit ADH and angiotensin, but your kidney, since the perfusion is still low, since your heart can't pump, it's going to kind of override that by increasing your renin even more. And therefore, you kind of have that cycle where you just keep having more and more fluid. And that's how you eventually end up being super swollen with heart failure. And your heart just can't pump all that increasing amount of fluid because the more fluid you have, the more harder you have to work, the more you stress out your heart, kaput. So those are some relationships that you can think about um, in regards to the heart, the kidney, your lungs, even as well. It's always acid and base. So acid and base deals with lungs, deals with kidneys. Blood pressure deals with heart as well. Hypertension is a cycle that can happen. Hopefully, this was helpful for just like getting the big picture of everything they kind of want you to know for the FOM3 midterm and or final. It's a lot of relationships. There's a lot of moving pieces. You're always more than welcome to kind of play this back and use this map to kind of figure out where those relationships are, or don't. Learn how you will. Thank you again, Krystle, for helping me with recording this.
No problem, Alan.
Did you stop it? Please stop it. They're going to hear this and it's still recording.
Paused it. Hold on. Let me. I'll stop it now. Okay.
Okay.
Stop